This is the cause of the generational curse and deaths in your family.
For 4 generations, every firstborn Harrington son dropped dead before turning 30. Geneticists flew in from Switzerland. Researchers at Johns Hopkins wrote papers about it. They called it the rarest hereditary curse in medical history. The Harrington gene, they named it. Untreatable, unstoppable, accept it. But the old beekeeper who worked that land for 40 years knew something the scientists didn't. She'd watched her own village die from poison everyone said wasn't there. And when she finally tested the soil in that garden, the one the family had eaten from for a century, what she found wasn't a curse. It was a confession buried 100 years deep. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The Harrington estate stretched across 200 acres of Virginia farmland. Rolling hills, white fences, a mansion that looked like it belonged in a history book. Magnolia trees lined the main drive. Horses grazed in paddocks that cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages. The family had built their fortune in agriculture, feeding America for 5 generations. But something was rotting at the heart of that legacy, and on this particular Tuesday in September, they were burying another one. Calhoun Harrington was lowered into Virginia clay on an afternoon so beautiful it felt like mockery. Blue sky, gentle breeze, birds singing in the old oak trees that had watched Harrington's die for 100 years. He was 29 years old. Organ failure, the doctors said. Just like his father, Beauregard, who died at 28. Just like his grandfather, Thaddeus, who died at 27. Just like his great-grandfather, Woodrow, who died at 30. 4 generations, 4 firstborn sons. All dead before their 30th birthday. The priest spoke words that no one really heard. Something about God's plan. Something about mysterious ways. The same empty phrases they'd used at every Harrington funeral since 1952. Standing at that grave, watching them lower his brother into the ground, was Shepherd Harrington. He was the second-born, the spare, the one who got to live because birth order had spared him. Shepherd was 58 now. His hair had gone white a decade ago. His eyes had gone hollow long before that. He'd spent his whole life watching firstborn sons die. First his older brother Calhoun Sr., who he'd idolized as a boy. Then his nephew Beauregard, who he'd taught to ride horses. Now his great-nephew, another Calhoun, who he'd bounced on his knee. He was tired of funerals, but there would be another one. Soon. Standing next to Shepherd, trembling in the September wind despite his expensive black suit, was the next victim. Calhoun's son, Bellamy Harrington, 26 years old, already showing the first symptoms. The tremors had started 3 months ago. Just a shake in his hands when he held his coffee cup. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone would notice unless they were looking. Bellamy was looking. He watched his hands shake every morning, counted the seconds between tremors, tracked the fatigue that rolled over him like fog that wouldn't lift, logged the moments when his mind went blank, when words disappeared mid-sentence, when he forgot where he was walking or why. The doctors called it early onset neurological decline, a precursor to the organ failure that would kill him, just like it killed his father. Just like it killed everyone. Bellamy had accepted it. He'd had 26 years to make peace with dying young. In a strange way, it was almost a relief to finally feel it happening. The waiting had been worse, but that wasn't what kept him awake at night. His wife, Jolene, stood beside him at the grave. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant. With a boy. Bellamy had done the math 1,000 times. If the curse was real, if it lived in his blood the way everyone said, his son would die before 32. He'd grow up in this beautiful mansion, eat from this beautiful land, and his organs would fail before he ever really got to live. The cycle would continue, unless someone broke it. Bellamy looked across the cemetery, past the mourners in their black clothes, past the flower arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. His eyes landed on a figure standing alone at the edge of the gathering, an old woman, dark skin weathered by decades of sun, white hair pulled back in a simple braid, wearing a plain black dress that didn't match the designer mourning clothes everyone else had on. Most of the mourners didn't even notice her. The ones who did had already forgotten she existed, but Bellamy knew who she was. The Beekeeper. Her name was Adaize Okonkwo, 71 years old, Nigerian by birth, Virginian by necessity. She'd worked as the Harrington Estate's beekeeper for 42 years, tending the apiaries that sat at the far edge of the property, invisible to everyone who didn't look. And she'd stopped believing in the Harrington curse a long time ago. But that's getting ahead of the story. To understand why Adaize knew what she knew, you have to understand where she came from. She grew up in a village called Ogoniland, in the Niger Delta. When she was young, the land was green and the rivers ran clear. Her people fished those rivers for generations. Her grandmother caught shrimp in the same waters her great-grandmother had. Then the oil companies came. Shell, Chevron, names that meant nothing to a little girl playing in the mud. They built pipelines through the village, dug wells in the forest, promised jobs and prosperity and a better life. What they delivered was poison. The spills started small. A leak here, a rupture there. Always accidents. Always being fixed. Always nothing to worry about. But Adaize's mother was a traditional healer. She knew the old ways, and she taught her daughter to read the land the way other children learn to read books. "Watch the animals," her mother said. "They know before we do. When the birds stop singing, when the fish float belly up, when the bees abandon their hives, that's when you run." The birds stopped singing in 1976. The fish started dying in 1977. By 1978, the children were sick. Adaize was 23 years old when her daughter was born. A beautiful girl, perfect and whole, and crying with lungs that worked exactly the way they should. She named her Amara, which means grace. Amara lived for 7 years. 7 years of watching her daughter grow sicker. 7 years of swollen bellies and yellowed eyes and doctors who shrugged and said there was nothing they could do. 7 years of government officials who said the water was safe, the air was clean, the oil companies were following regulations. Amara died in her mother's arms on a Tuesday afternoon, just like Calhoun Harrington, buried now in Virginia clay. Just like all the Harrington men who came before him, different poisons, same lies. After Amara died, Adaize left Nigeria. There was nothing left for her there. Her village was dying. Her people were scattered. The land that had sustained her ancestors for centuries was soaked in oil and grief. She landed in Virginia in 1982 with nothing but a suitcase and a skill. Bees. Her mother had kept bees. Her grandmother had kept bees. Adaize knew how to read their movements, their moods, their warnings, and she knew something else too. Bees die first. When the land is poisoned, when the water is wrong, when something invisible is killing everything. The bees know. They feel it before the birds, before the fish, before the children. The bees are the canary in the coal mine. For 42 years, Adaize kept the Harrington bees alive. 12 hives, painted white, humming with life. She talked to them the way her mother had taught her, listened to their songs, watched their patterns, and for 42 years, she watched Harrington men die. She saw the pattern. Firstborn sons only. Always, before 30. Always the same symptoms. Tremors, fog, organ failure. Always the ones who stayed on the estate, who ate every meal in the family dining room, who never left. The second-born survived. The ones sent to boarding school. The ones who traveled. The ones who ate somewhere else. Adaez noticed, but she said nothing. Who was she? An immigrant beekeeper with no credentials and no authority. A woman who cleaned her own cottage and cashed her modest paycheck and kept her suspicions to herself. Besides, she wasn't sure. Not really. Just a feeling. A pattern that might mean nothing. Until 6 months ago, when her bees started dying. It began in March. One hive went silent. The queen stopped laying. The workers disappeared. Adaezi found dead bees scattered at the entrance, their bodies discolored in a way that made her hands tremble. She'd seen that color before, in the birds of Ogoniland, poisoned by oil. By May, she'd lost 4 colonies. The bees weren't just dying, they were dying wrong. Colony collapse looked different. Disease looked different. This was something in the environment, something in the land, something her mother had taught her to recognize. Adaeze walked to the family garden one evening. The sun was setting, painting everything gold. The garden was beautiful. Tomatoes climbing their stakes, squash spreading across the beds, peppers hanging heavy and red. A picture of abundance, a picture of health. But Adaeze knelt down and took a handful of soil. She brought it to her nose, and the smell hit her like a memory, like Nigeria, like death. Heavy, metallic, wrong. She'd spent 42 years ignoring her suspicions, telling herself she was imagining things, telling herself she was just a beekeeper, not a scientist, not someone who could question the experts. But her bees were dying, and that smell was real. She stood up slowly, the soil still in her hand, and looked at the garden that had fed the Harrington family for 100 years. "God forgive me," she whispered. "What have I been watching all this time?" Getting proof was a problem. Adaeze had no credentials, no degree, no authority. If she walked into Shepherd Harrington's study and said, "I think your garden is poisoning your family," he'd fire her on the spot. Or laugh at her. Or both. She needed evidence. Real evidence. But who was going to help an old beekeeper test some dirt? It took her 3 weeks to find an answer. Dr. Yusuf Rahman was a professor at Virginia Tech, environmental sciences. He'd visited the Harrington apiaries 8 years ago for a study on pollinator decline. Adaeze had given him access to her hives, shared her observation logs, even let him take some bees for his research. He owed her. She called him on a Thursday evening, her voice steady despite the way her heart was pounding. "Dr. Rahman, I don't know if you remember me. Adaeze Okonkwo, from the Harrington estate. The beekeeper." His voice was warm. "Of course I remember. Your observation logs were invaluable. How are the colonies?" "Dying." Silence on the line. 4 hives since March," Adaeze continued, "and I think I know why, but I need your help to prove it." She sent him a soil sample by FedEx. 3 weeks later, he called her back. "Adaeze." His voice was different now, careful. "Where exactly did you get this soil?" "A garden, on the estate where I work." "A garden." He repeated the word like he didn't believe it. "This soil is toxic. Arsenic, lead, cadmium, the levels are off the charts. This isn't contamination from fertilizer or pesticides. This is industrial. There's a source underground. Something big." Adaeze closed her eyes. How long would it take for someone to get sick from eating vegetables grown in this soil? Depends on exposure. Occasional consumption, maybe nothing. But daily exposure over years, the metals would accumulate. Organ damage, neurological decline, eventually complete systemic failure. And if someone ate from this soil their whole life, from birth, another silence, longer this time. They'd die young, Dr. Rahman said finally. Probably before 30, and the symptoms would look like a genetic disease, something hereditary, because it would only affect people in the same household, eating the same food. Adaizi thanked him and hung up. Then she sat in her cottage for a long time, thinking about 4 generations of dead men, thinking about Bellamy, trembling at his father's funeral, thinking about the baby growing in Jolene's belly, thinking about what she had to do next. The Harrington Library was a temple to family history, floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather-bound volumes, records going back to the 1870s, when the first Harrington bought this land with money from tobacco and determination. Adairs had been inside exactly twice in 42 years, once to pick up a book about beekeeping that someone had ordered for her, once to deliver honey to Mr. Harrington's study. But she had keys to the main house. All the senior staff did, and she'd spent 4 decades learning which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, which hours were safe. She went in at midnight. The records were organized chronologically. Births, deaths, marriages, land purchases, construction projects. Every triumph and tragedy documented in careful script. Adaiz worked by flashlight, pulling volumes from shelves, searching for something she wasn't sure existed. It took her 3 nights to find it. A map from 1919, the north section of the property, where the garden now stood. But in 1919, it wasn't a garden. It was a mine, the Harrington Copper and Arsenic Mine, operating since 1895. 30 workers at its peak. A profitable operation that had funded the family's expansion into agriculture. Adaizi's hands trembled as she traced the map. The mine shaft was right there, exactly where the garden beds now sat, exactly where the tomatoes grew fat and red and poisonous. She kept digging. The County Historical Society had archives too. Adaiz visited on a Wednesday afternoon, wearing her church clothes, trying to look respectable. The archivist was a young white woman who looked at her with mild suspicion. "I'm researching the Harrington family," Adaiz said, "for a book." It wasn't entirely a lie. Someday, someone would write this story, and she was gathering the chapters. The archivist led her to a dusty back room, file cabinets dating back to the 1800s. "Help yourself. Just sign out anything you take to the copy room." Adaiz spent 6 hours in that room. Her back ached, her eyes strained, but she found what she was looking for. October 14th, 1920, a newspaper clipping from the Charlottesville Daily Progress. Tragic collapse at Harrington Mine. A catastrophic collapse at the Harrington family mine in Albemarle County claimed 12 lives yesterday. All workers are believed dead. No survivors. Recovery efforts suspended pending investigation. That was it. 1 paragraph. No follow-up story. No list of the dead. No investigation results. Adaiz checked the county records next. A ledger from January 1921, 3 months after the collapse. An amendment to the Harrington Property Survey. The mine shaft was no longer listed. In its place, 4 words. Family Garden, established 1920. Someone had filled in that shaft, buried those 12 men where they fell, covered them with concrete and topsoil, and planted vegetables over their graves. For 100 years, the Harrington family had been eating from poisoned ground. The curse wasn't genetic. It was murder disguised as tradition. Adaiz knew she had to tell someone. But who? Shepard Harrington was the patriarch, the decision-maker, the man who signed her paychecks. If she went to him with this story, an old woman with no credentials accusing his ancestors of manslaughter, he could destroy her. But if she stayed silent, Bellamy would die, and then his son. and then his son's son. The cycle would continue until someone finally dug up the truth. She thought about her daughter, Amara, 7 years old when she died. Same symptoms, different poison, same silence from the people in power. Daisy had stayed quiet back then, had trusted the experts, had believed the official story even when her mother's voice in her head screamed that something was wrong. She wouldn't make that mistake again. She requested a meeting with Shepherd Harrington. To her surprise, he agreed. Perhaps he was curious. Perhaps he was bored. Perhaps 42 years of quiet service had earned her the right to take up 15 minutes of his time. They met in his study, late afternoon, sunlight streaming through tall windows, portraits of dead Harrington men staring down from the walls like witnesses. Shepherd sat behind his desk, expensive suit, silver cufflinks, the posture of a man who had never been questioned by someone like her. "You wanted to see me, Adais. What can I do for you?" She told him everything. The bees, the soil tests, the mine collapse, the buried workers, the garden. She laid out the evidence, the map, the newspaper clipping, the property records, Dr. Rahman's lab results. Shepherd listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds. Then he spoke. "You're telling me that my family has been poisoning itself for a century?" "Yes, sir. That my brother didn't die from a genetic curse. He was poisoned by vegetables. The soil, sir, the heavy metals, they accumulate in the plants. Your brother ate from that garden every day of his life. So did your father. So did your grandfather." Shepherd's face hardened. Something shifted behind his eyes. "And what exactly are your qualifications? You're a beekeeper. You tend bees. You have no medical degree, no training in toxicology, no expertise in anything except honey." "I know what poison looks like, sir. I've seen it. Before. In my country. In my village. I watched my own daughter die from contaminated water that the government said was safe. I'm sorry for your loss." His voice said he wasn't sorry at all. "But this isn't Nigeria. This is America. The Harrington curse has been studied by the finest medical institutions in the world. Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, researchers in Switzerland, in Germany, in Japan. $30 million in funding. Papers published in peer-reviewed journals. Are you telling me that you—" He jabbed a finger at her. "A beekeeper with no education, figured out something that every scientist on Earth couldn't. They were looking in the wrong place, sir. They looked at blood. They never looked at land." Shepherd stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "Get out." "Sir, Bellamy is dying. Your great-nephew. He has the tremors already. If we don't—" "I said get out." His voice cracked like a whip. "You've worked here for 42 years, Adaisi. 42 years. I respected you. My father respected you, but this—" He swept his hand across the desk, scattering her papers. "This is madness. Conspiracy theories. Delusions. I want you off my property by morning." Adaisi stood slowly. Her bones ached. Her heart ached worse. "I watched my village die from poison everyone said wasn't there," she said quietly. "I made a promise after my daughter died. Never again. Never again would I stay silent while children suffered." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "The truth doesn't need your permission, Mr. Harrington. It just waits until someone is brave enough to dig it up." She left, but she didn't leave the property. Not yet. Word traveled fast in the Harrington household. By nightfall, everyone knew the old beekeeper had lost her mind, had accused the family of poisoning itself, had been fired on the spot. Good riddance. But Bellamy Harrington couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. He found her cottage at the edge of the apiaries. She was packing by candlelight. The power had already been cut to her quarters. "You're Calhoun's boy," she said when he appeared in her doorway. Not a question. "Bellamy, you've got the tremors. I can see them from here." He looked at his hands. They were shaking worse than usual. Adrenaline, probably. Or fear. It started 3 months ago. It'll get worse. "I know." He stepped inside. "Tell me what you told my uncle." So she did. Everything. And when she finished, Bellamy was pale as a ghost. "Every birthday dinner," he whispered. "Every Thanksgiving. Every meal my mother made from that garden because it was tradition. Your father ate from it his whole life. Your grandfather. Your great-grandfather. But not Uncle Shepherd. He was sent away to school at 8. Adaies nodded. "Second-born sons leave the estate young. They eat from the garden less. The poison doesn't accumulate." Bellamy sat heavily in her only chair. "My son, if Jolene and I stay here, he'll die like you, like all of them." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the bees hummed in their dying hives. "Help me prove it," Bellamy said finally. "Help me prove it before I'm gone." Adaies looked at this young man, 26 years old, already fading, already sentenced to death by tradition, but still fighting. She thought of Amara, 7 years old and gone. "I'll need to dig," she said. "In that garden. At night. If what I think is down there is really down there. I'll get you access, whatever you need. Your uncle will call the police if he catches us." Bellamy's jaw tightened. "Then we won't get caught." They waited 3 weeks. Long enough for the scandal to die down. Long enough for Shepherd to stop watching. Long enough for Bellamy to figure out which security cameras covered the garden and how to disable them. On a moonless night in late October, Adaies returned to the estate. The garden looked different in darkness. The plants were shadows. The soil was black. The mansion loomed in the distance, a few windows still lit. Bellamy was already there, leaning against a shovel, his hands trembling despite the work gloves. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No." Adaies took the second shovel from the wheelbarrow she'd hidden behind the tool shed. "But I'm sure about everything else, and that means I have to be sure about this too." They started digging. The work was brutal. Adaies' body screamed in protest. 71 years old, and she was breaking ground like a farmhand in the middle of the night. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Bellamy helped until his tremors got too bad. Then he sat on the stone wall and watched, his breath coming in shallow gasps. 2 hours passed. 3. At 3:17 a.m., Adaies' shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. Bone. She dropped to her knees, brushing away soil with her bare hands. A skull emerged from the darkness. Eye sockets filled with earth, jaw hanging loose. Then another skull. Then another. 12 of them, laid out in rows, exactly where they'd fallen 104 years ago. Bellamy vomited into the pepper plants, but Adaies kept digging. She found tools, pickaxes, helmets, lanterns crusted with rust. She found a lunch pail with a name scratched into the tin. W. Kowalski. She found work boots with the leather rotted away, leaving only brass eyelets. And she found something else. A leather journal, wrapped in oilcloth, preserved by the earth that had hidden it for a century. She opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1920. The shaft collapsed today. 12 men dead. God forgive me, but I cannot let this destroy what my father built. The investigation would ruin us. They would find the unsafe timbers. They would find the cost cutting. They would find the letters from the foreman warning me that this would happen. I have paid the sheriff. The coroner will rule it an accident and close the case. The bodies will stay where they fell. I will fill the shaft with concrete and plant over it a garden. The family will eat from this ground, and we will carry these men with us forever. It is the only way to honor their sacrifice. It is the only way to remember. The final entry, dated January 1921. The garden is thriving. My wife remarks on how well the tomatoes grow. The soil is rich, she says, nourished. I have not told her what lies beneath. I never will. Let the land keep its secrets. Let my sons inherit this soil and make something beautiful from it. That is my prayer. That is my penance. It was signed, Cornelius Harrington. Adais read the final line aloud. Her voice was hollow. He thought he was honoring them. He was poisoning his own bloodline for 100 years. Bellamy took the journal with shaking hands. Tears were streaming down his face. He didn't seem to notice. "My father," he whispered. The last thing he said to me, before the end, was that he was sorry he couldn't beat it. Sorry he wasn't strong enough to survive. He died thinking he was weak, thinking the curse had beaten him. It wasn't his fault. I know that now. Bellamy looked up at her. But he didn't. He died blaming himself. My grandfather died blaming himself. 4 generations of men who thought they were failures because they couldn't survive a poison that was feeding them from birth. Adais put a hand on his shoulder. That's what poison does. It makes you think you're the problem. It makes you turn the blame inward. The companies that poisoned my village, they did the same thing. Told us we were sick because we didn't eat right, didn't live right, didn't pray hard enough. How do you stand it? Knowing the truth and not being able to change the past. You can't change the past. Adais looked at the bones of 12 forgotten men. But you can change the future. That's what we're doing tonight. Bellamy wiped his eyes. This is proof. It's more than proof. Adais looked at the bones gleaming in her flashlight beam. It's a crime scene, and it changes everything. The confrontation happened 2 days later. Bellamy brought everything to the family study. The journal, the soil tests, photographs of the bones. He laid it out on his uncle's desk while Shepard stared at him like he'd grown a second head. You dug up the garden? I dug up the truth. Shepard read the journal 3 times. His face went through every stage of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, despair. Finally, he looked up. Cornelius, our great-great-grandfather, he knew. The whole time he knew. He didn't know it would kill us, Bellamy said. He thought he was being noble, making us carry the weight of what he'd done. But the scientists, $30 million in research, they looked at blood, not soil. They found genetic markers and stopped looking. Why search for poison when you already have an answer? Shepard sat down heavily. He looked old suddenly, older than his 58 years. Can you be saved? He asked quietly. Is there still time? Chelation therapy. It removes heavy metals from the body. If I start now, if I stop eating from that garden forever, I might have a chance. Shepard was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Adais, standing silent in the corner. I fired you. Yes. I called you a madwoman. Yes. And you came back anyway. You dug in my garden in the middle of the night and found 12 bodies. 13. Adais' voice was steady. The 13th was going to be Bellamy, if no one had listened. Shepard closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. What do we do now? The answer was, everything. The next 72 hours were chaos. Bellamy contacted a lawyer first. Not the family lawyer, a new one, someone without ties to the Harrington Foundation or its $30 million of genetic research funding. Someone who would, ask hard questions. The lawyer's name was Theodora Washington. a black woman from Richmond who'd made her reputation suing chemical companies. When Bellamy showed her the journal and the soil tests, she went very still. "You understand what you're asking me to do," she said. "You're asking me to prove that your family committed manslaughter, covered it up, and then accidentally poisoned 4 generations of their own heirs. Yes, and you're the heir. You're the one who stands to inherit everything. You're asking me to help you destroy your own family's reputation. I'm asking you to help me save my son." Theodora studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. "I know some people at the EPA. This is going to get very complicated very fast." She was right. The EPA arrived within 48 hours. They excavated the garden, exhumed the 12 miners, declared the entire north section of the estate a hazardous waste site. The contamination was worse than anyone had imagined. 100 years of arsenic and cadmium and lead leaching into the groundwater, spreading further every decade. The miners' remains were identified through historical records and DNA matching. 12 men, 12 families who'd never known what happened to their loved ones. The Harrington Foundation tracked down every descendant and told them the truth. Bellamy started chelation therapy immediately. The treatments were brutal: nausea, exhaustion, pain that made his tremors look like nothing. But week by week, the heavy metals left his blood. Month by month, his symptoms improved. For the first time in his life, he stopped planning his funeral. Shepard held a press conference on the mansion steps. He told the world everything: the mine collapse, the cover-up, the poisoned garden, the 4 generations of men who'd died because their ancestor couldn't face what he'd done. "The Harrington curse was never genetic," he said, his voice cracking. "It was geological, and it was our responsibility. My family's responsibility. We failed those 12 miners 100 years ago. We failed our own sons ever since. That ends today." The scientific community was in uproar. The Harrington gene had been studied for decades. Papers had been published. Careers had been built. Dr. Emiliano Vance, the Johns Hopkins researcher who'd coined the term Harrington syndrome, called a press conference to defend his work. "The genetic markers we identified are real," he insisted. "This environmental contamination theory doesn't explain everything." But when reporters started digging, the story fell apart. Dr. Vance had received $2.3 million in Harrington Foundation grants over 15 years. His research had never once suggested testing the family's environment, because that would have ended the gravy train. Other researchers came forward, whispers that they'd suggested environmental factors years ago, only to be told the Foundation wasn't interested. Hints that the genetic explanation had been preferred because it was more dramatic, more fundable, more interesting to the media. The Harrington curse had been profitable. A lot of people had built careers on it, and none of them had ever thought to test the soil. The Harrington Foundation, all $30 million of it, was redirected. No more genetic research. From now on, it would fund environmental justice. Clean water, soil testing, the kind of work that might have saved Adaeze's village, the kind of work that could save villages like it. And Adaeze Okonkwo, the beekeeper who'd seen what no scientist could, was named the Foundation's first director. Bellamy's son was born on a March morning, 2 days after the last truckload of contaminated soil was hauled away. He came into the world screaming, loud, healthy, furious at being evicted from the warmth of his mother's body. The doctors ran every test they could think of: blood panels, heavy metal screenings, organ function. All clear. The curse was broken. A nurse brought Bellamy a chair because his legs had given out. He sat beside Jolene's bed, holding his son, weeping in a way he hadn't allowed himself to weep since his father died. "He's going to live," he kept saying. "He's going to grow up. He's going to have a life. Jolene reached out and touched his face. So are you. It was true. The chelation therapy had worked better than anyone expected. Bellamy's tremors were almost gone. His mind was clear. The doctors said he might live to see 80, maybe longer. After a lifetime of planning for death, he had to learn how to plan for life. Bellamy held his son in the delivery room, this tiny creature who would never eat from that garden, who would never carry the poison in his blood, who would live. Jolene was crying. What are we going to name him? Bellamy thought about his father, dead at 29. His grandfather. His great-grandfather. 4 generations of men who believed they were cursed by God, who made peace with early deaths, who never knew the truth was buried beneath their feet. He thought about Adais, the beekeeper from Nigeria who lost her daughter to poison, who kept her suspicions quiet for 42 years because she had no credentials, no authority, no power. But she'd listened to the land. She'd trusted what she knew, and when the moment came, she'd risked everything to dig up the truth. We're naming him after her, Bellamy said. Her surname, Okonkwo. He looked down at his son. Okonkwo Harrington, so he never forgets who saved his life, who saved all of us. Adais stood in the doorway. She hadn't asked to be there. Bellamy had insisted. She crossed the room slowly, her old bones protesting, and placed her weathered hand on the baby's head. You were never cursed, she whispered. You were just waiting for someone to dig up the truth. 6 months later, the memorial was unveiled. It stood where the garden used to be, now a meadow of native wildflowers, planted over decontaminated soil. 12 stone markers, each bearing a name that had been forgotten for a century. Wilhelm Kowalski, Jeremiah Tate, Absalom Freeman, Hezekiah Grant, Obadiah Shaw, Cornelius Brown, Ezekiel Martin, Josiah Cole, Zachariah Hayes, Theron Black, Whitfield Price, Montgomery Reed. Their descendants came from across the country, some angry, some grateful, all of them finally knowing what had happened to their people. Shepherd spoke at the ceremony. His voice cracked twice, but he finished. After the crowd dispersed, Adaizi stood alone at the memorial. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. Bellamy found her there. You okay? She nodded slowly. I was thinking about Amara, my daughter. She was 7 when she died. Same poison, different country. I couldn't save her. But you saved my son. Adais turned to look at him, at this young man who should have been dead by now, who was instead standing in the fading light, healthy, whole, alive. My mother used to say that God doesn't waste our pain, that everything we suffer, he recycles into something useful. She looked back at the memorial stones. I never believed her, thought pain was just pain. But now I think maybe I had to lose Amara so I could recognize what was killing your family. Maybe I had to watch my village die so I could save yours. Bellamy was quiet for a moment. That's a hard way to look at it. It's the only way I can live with it. They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wildflowers swayed in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, new bees were building new hives, and for the first time in 100 years, the land was clean. For a century, the Harrington family believed they were cursed by God. They spent millions on doctors, scientists, specialists, anyone who could explain why their firstborn sons kept dying. But the answer wasn't in their blood, it was in their soil. It took a beekeeper from Kutu, Nigeria, a woman who'd watched her own village die from poison, to see what no scientist could. Sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones with degrees and credentials. Sometimes they're the ones who've already survived what we're going through. If this story moved you, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been saved by someone no one expected? I'll see you in the next one.